Evan Harper, 36, millionaire CEO and master of control, walked into a quiet restaurant expecting nothing more than a peaceful meal. But before his order even arrived, a 9-year-old girl with ice blue eyes and a storm in her voice stood at his table and said, "You left my mom before I was born." He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. And he definitely didn't know she might be his daughter. Evan Harper, at just 36, had already lived the kind of life most people could only dream of. CEO of a billion-dollar tech firm, with sleek offices in San Francisco and satellite locations overseas, he was the face of modern success, sharp, composed, always in control. His dark hair was neatly styled, his navy suit pressed to perfection, and his striking blue eyes missed nothing. Yet on that particular evening, he wasn't chasing a deal, managing a crisis, or being photographed at some elite event. He just wanted dinner. Alone. Quiet. He had chosen a small, elegant restaurant tucked away from the city's rush, one of those places where the lights were low, the staff discreet, and the dishes were crafted like art. Evan didn't even look at the menu. He came here often enough that they already knew what to bring. He sat by the window, scrolling absently through unread emails on his phone, mentally preparing to leave it all behind, at least for the hour he hoped to be left in peace. Then he felt it, an unusual presence beside his table. Not the waiter, not a fan, not a colleague. He looked up, instinctively alert, and froze. A young girl was standing there. No more than 9, maybe 10. Her clothes were worn, faded jeans, a coat that looked 2 winters old, and scuffed shoes. Her long dark hair was slightly messy, but clean. Her skin was pale from the cold outside. And her eyes, icy, vibrant blue, stared straight into his with a kind of intensity that sent a chill down his spine. Eyes that looked too much like his own. He blinked, confused, trying to make sense of her presence. But before he could say anything, she spoke. "You left my mom before I was even born," she said, her voice calm, steady, and full of something far heavier than her age should allow. "And now you're sitting here like you're just some nice guy." The words hit harder than he expected. Not because they were loud or cruel, she didn't shout, didn't cry, but because they were delivered with a certainty that shook him. Evan was rarely caught off guard, but in that moment, he couldn't even form a response. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The girl stood her ground, arms crossed, her chin slightly lifted like she was daring him to deny it. Who is your mom?" he asked finally, his voice lower than usual, almost unsure. She stared at him for a few seconds longer, as if deciding whether he deserved the answer. "Haley Stevens," she said. Evan felt the name slam into him like a wave of cold water. He knew that name. He hadn't heard it in years, but it wasn't one he could forget. Haley had worked for his company almost a decade ago. They had shared a brief but meaningful connection, quiet, unspoken, intense. It ended as quickly as it began. He'd left for a long-term project in London, and when he returned, she was gone. No goodbyes, no message, no contact. He had asked about her, but his then-assistant said she had resigned suddenly and moved out of the city. With so much going on, he eventually let it go. But now a girl with his eyes was standing in front of him, saying words that made the hair on his arms rise. "I never even got a chance to hate you properly," the girl added. "Because you were just gone." Then, just as quickly as she appeared, she turned and walked away, weaving through tables and out the door before Evan could stop her. He sat there, motionless, his mind racing to catch up with what just happened. The restaurant faded into a blur around him, the low music, the clinking of dishes, the soft footsteps of waiters. Everything was suddenly distant. He pressed his hands to the table, trying to breathe evenly. Haley. A child. His eyes. And a sentence he couldn't stop hearing over and over in his head: "You left my mom before I was even born." Something was terribly wrong. And for the first time in a long time, Evan Harper had no idea what to do next. Evan didn't leave the restaurant right away. He sat there long after his untouched meal was taken away, staring out the window into the early evening haze as the girl's words played over and over in his mind. The city outside continued as usual, cars passed, people laughed as they walked arm in arm, delivery drivers rushed by on bikes, but for Evan, time had lost its rhythm. His heart was still thudding from the encounter, and his mind was trying to sort through the impossibility of what had just happened. It didn't feel real. A child. A daughter. Haley's daughter. His daughter? He leaned forward, elbows on the table, hands pressed together near his mouth, replaying every memory he had of Haley Stevens. It had been almost 10 years, but the images returned with surprising clarity. She was quiet but smart, sharp-witted beneath a calm surface. They had worked closely on a short but intense project, a late-stage software acquisition that required long hours and late nights. That was when things had shifted. It wasn't a wild romance, it was more subtle, more mature, stolen moments, long conversations after hours, the kind of connection that didn't need labels. Then came the promotion and the move to London. Everything had happened fast. He remembered asking Haley if she wanted to talk about what was happening between them before he left, but she had brushed it off with a smile, saying, "Go build your empire." And so, he did. But when he returned 3 months later, she was gone. He had asked his assistant, Mark, what happened, and Mark told him she had resigned suddenly and requested her file be deleted from internal systems. Nothing unusual, no forwarding contact, just gone. He accepted it, told himself maybe it wasn't meant to be. And as always, he threw himself back into work. But now, it was all unraveling. That girl, the eyes. They were exactly like his. And not just in color, but in something deeper, an intensity, a way of holding back emotion but still letting it burn underneath. He couldn't deny it. He didn't want to. And yet, if it was true, then it meant he had missed 9 years of a life he never knew existed. It meant Haley had carried that secret alone. And it meant that a little girl had grown up believing her father had abandoned her before she was even born. Evan finally stood and left the restaurant, ignoring the manager who tried to wish him a good evening. He got into the back of his black SUV, nodded to the driver, and sat in silence as the city lights blurred past the windows. He didn't go home. He went to the office. The building was mostly empty, just a few engineers working late and a janitor mopping the marble lobby floor. He walked to his private office on the 35th floor, overlooking the skyline, and sat down behind the desk where he'd made so many life-altering decisions. But none felt as urgent as this one. He pulled out his phone and opened his old email archives. Haley's name didn't come up. No emails. Nothing in the employee system either. It had all been scrubbed, just as Mark had said. But something about that started to bother him. Why would she vanish without even a goodbye? Why would she delete everything? And why had he taken that explanation at face value? He opened a search engine and typed in her name, Haley Stevens, California. It wasn't long before he found a result that matched, Haley M. Stevens, librarian at a public school in Oakland. He clicked the link. There was a staff photo. And there she was. She hadn't changed as much as he expected. A little older, maybe, and her eyes looked more tired, but it was her. The same expression, the same calm presence in her features. His stomach twisted. Below her name was a contact email. He copied it, stared at the address for a long moment, then closed the laptop. He needed more than an email. He needed the truth. Without hesitation, he reached out to a private investigator he had used before for business background checks. It was after midnight, but Evan didn't care. "I need everything you can find on a woman named Haley Stevens," he said. "I want to know where she lives, where she's worked, and if she has a daughter." He didn't say the words out loud, but they burned inside him. "If she has my daughter." The investigator promised results within 48 hours. Evan ended the call and finally leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling in the dark office. His empire had been built on logic, strategy, and power, but none of that helped him now. This wasn't a merger or an acquisition. This was something far more fragile and far more important. He had always believed he was in control of his story. But tonight, he had learned that someone else had written an entire chapter without him, and now, he had to decide what he was going to do with it. 2 days later, Evan sat in the back of his car again, his fingers tapping a steady rhythm against the leather seat as the city blurred by beyond the tinted windows. He hadn't slept well since that night. Everything inside him was restless, mind sharp but heart heavy, the way it gets when something you thought was settled suddenly breaks open. He had always believed in controlling outcomes, in solving problems with precision and speed. But this wasn't a problem. This was a life. A child. His child. And every hour that passed without knowing more felt like a weight pressing on his chest. The investigator delivered quickly. A full report had landed on Evan's desk that morning. Haley Stevens still lived in Oakland, just a few miles from the school where she worked as a librarian. She rented a small 2-bedroom apartment in a modest complex with aging paint and rusted mailboxes. No criminal record, no debts, no social scandals. She lived quietly, frugally. There was a daughter, Sophie Stevens, age 9. Born in March, just 9 months after Evan had left for London. There was no father listed on the birth certificate. When Evan read that line, he just sat there, holding the paper in his hands for a long time. He thought of everything he'd missed, her first words, her first steps, birthdays, school plays, scraped knees and giggles and tears. The milestones most parents took for granted were invisible to him, locked away in a story he hadn't even known he was part of. And it stung, not with anger at Haley, but with a grief he couldn't name. He had become a father without ever being given the chance. But now he knew. And that changed everything. He arrived outside the school just after 3 p.m., just as students began to trickle out of the building, some laughing, some dragging backpacks twice their size. He didn't want to approach Sophie on school grounds, didn't want to cause a scene or frighten her. Instead, he waited in his car across the street, hands gripping the wheel although he wasn't the one driving. His heart beat too fast, and for the first time in years, he felt uncertain, not about what was right, but about whether he had the right to show up. Then he saw her. Sophie stepped out the front doors, clutching a spiral notebook and wearing a backpack nearly bigger than she was. Her long dark hair was tied in a loose braid that swung over one shoulder, and she looked around briefly before walking down the steps. It hit him like a blow. She was the same girl from the restaurant, but in daylight, surrounded by other children, he saw even more clearly how much she looked like him. The same sharp jawline, the same alert posture, the same eyes, bright blue and full of thought. His breath caught. She met someone on the sidewalk, a woman in a soft gray sweater and faded jeans. Haley. She hadn't seen him yet. Her hair was longer than he remembered, lighter in color now, probably from the sun. There were faint lines around her eyes, the kind that come from years of worry, but she still carried herself with quiet confidence. Sophie handed her something, and Haley laughed softly, touching her daughter's hair in a way that made Evan's chest tighten. He couldn't watch from a distance any longer. He stepped out of the car and walked toward them slowly, carefully, not wanting to frighten either of them. Haley glanced up when she heard footsteps, and the moment their eyes met, her face froze. Recognition flickered instantly. She didn't move, didn't speak, but everything about her stiffened. Evan stopped a few feet away, not sure if he should come closer. His voice came out lower than he expected. "Hi, Haley." She didn't respond right away. Her eyes flicked toward Sophie, who was distracted by something in her backpack. Then she looked back at him with a guarded expression, somewhere between confusion, disbelief, and something harder to define. Hurt, maybe. Or fear. "What are you doing here?" she asked, keeping her voice even. "I need to talk to you," he said quietly. "Alone?" Haley looked down at Sophie again. "I need to get her home." "I understand," he said quickly. "Please. Just give me 5 minutes. After that, if you want me gone, I'll go." She studied him for a long moment, then turned to Sophie and said, "Go wait in the car, honey. I'll be there in a minute." Sophie obeyed, not arguing, though she glanced at Evan with a flicker of suspicion before walking to the small sedan parked nearby. When they were alone, Haley crossed her arms, her expression still guarded. "You don't get to just show up out of nowhere," she said. "I know," he said. "I wouldn't have if I didn't, Haley, I didn't know. I swear to you. I had no idea you were pregnant. If I had known, I never would have left like that." She looked away, blinking slowly. "I asked about you when I came back," he continued. "Mark said you had resigned. No number, no forwarding address. He said you didn't want to be found." Her lips tightened. "He told me you were moving on," Evan added. "That it was your choice." Haley laughed softly, bitterly. "Of course he did." "You didn't tell me," Evan said. "Why?" "I was angry," she admitted, her voice cracking slightly. "You left so easily. I thought you didn't care. And I wasn't going to beg for anything. I didn't want Sophie to grow up waiting for someone who might never show up." Evan stepped closer, carefully. "I'm here now. I know it doesn't fix the past. I know it's late. But I'm here." Haley looked at him, really looked, and for a second, something in her gaze softened, then quickly steeled again. "She doesn't know who you are," she said. "And I don't know if I want her to." "Not yet." "I'll wait," Evan said. "As long as it takes. But I'm not going anywhere." They stood in silence for a moment, the wind tugging gently at their clothes, the sound of distant car horns blending with children's laughter in the schoolyard behind them. Then Haley gave a small nod, not a welcome, not forgiveness, but something like a door not fully closed. "I'll think about it," she said. And that, for Evan, was more than enough to hope. The days that followed moved slowly, marked by silence more than anything else. Evan didn't call Haley again, and she didn't reach out to him either. There was a quiet tension in the space between them, a heavy pause filled with questions neither of them knew how to ask yet. Evan didn't want to force his way in. He knew that showing up uninvited wouldn't make things better, it would only reinforce everything Haley feared about his presence. So he waited, checking his phone more often than he cared to admit, rereading their brief conversation in his mind and analyzing every word, every look in her eyes. He didn't know what Sophie had been told after their meeting. She hadn't come storming into his life again like she had that first night at the restaurant, but he saw her once, by accident, while driving near her school. She was walking beside her mother, holding a book against her chest, her long braids swinging with each step. She looked like a normal kid. But Evan now understood that behind that small frame was a girl who'd spent her life believing she'd been abandoned. He couldn't change what she believed overnight. But maybe, with time, he could shift the truth enough to show her that her story wasn't finished yet. Then one afternoon, Haley sent him a message. It was short, direct. Just an address and a time, Saturday, 11 a.m. She didn't say what it was for or whether Sophie knew. Evan didn't need details. He cleared his schedule without hesitation and made sure he arrived 15 minutes early. He waited in his car across the street, not wanting to appear too eager, but the anticipation was making his chest feel tight. He hadn't been this nervous since his first investor pitch, and that one had involved $40 million. At exactly 11, he stepped out and walked up the short path to a modest brick duplex with a small yard in front. The grass was dry from the season, and a wind chime hanging by the porch door clinked softly in the breeze. Before he could knock, the door opened, and there was Haley, looking like she hadn't slept much. She nodded slightly and stepped aside to let him in. "She's in the living room," she said quietly. Evan stepped in, glancing around. The home was small but clean, filled with books, photographs, and the comforting clutter of real life: backpacks, crayons, dishes drying on a rack. It felt lived in a way his penthouse never had. He followed Haley down the hallway until they reached the living room, where Sophie sat cross-legged on the floor, drawing in a sketchpad. She didn't look up right away. Her hair was loose today, falling around her shoulders, and she wore a sweatshirt that looked a size too big, the sleeves bunched at her wrists. When she did glance up, her eyes locked onto Evan's with a guarded expression. Haley cleared her throat. "Sophie, this is Mr. Harper. He'd like to talk to you." Sophie didn't say anything. She just nodded once and set her pencil down. "I'll give you two some space," Haley said, then disappeared into the kitchen. Evan sat down on the edge of the couch, not too close, giving Sophie room. She pulled her knees up slightly, arms around them, and waited. "I'm not sure where to start," Evan said, his voice gentle. "Maybe with 'I'm sorry.'" She didn't respond. "I didn't know about you," he continued. "Not until just a few days ago. If I had, I would have been there. Every day. I would have wanted to know everything." Sophie tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You didn't look very shocked at the restaurant," she said finally. Evan gave a soft, almost sad laugh. "I was. You just caught me off guard. And I think I saw my own eyes looking back at me, and I couldn't process it fast enough." Sophie didn't smile, but her face shifted just slightly, her expression no longer sharp, but thoughtful. "Mom said you didn't leave because of me," she said. "She said you didn't know." "She's right," Evan said. "But that doesn't change the fact that you've had to live with that hurt. And I can't fix the past, no matter how much I want to. But I'm here now. And if you let me, I'd like to stay." There was a long pause. Sophie looked down at her hands, picking at her sleeve. "Why now?" she asked. "Why do you care all of a sudden?" "I think I always would have," Evan said honestly. "I just didn't get the chance. But now that I know you exist, nothing else feels more important." Sophie looked up at him again, her eyes unreadable. "What do you even know about kids?" she asked. "Almost nothing," Evan admitted, smiling softly. "But I'm a fast learner." This time, her mouth twitched, just barely. Not quite a smile, but close enough. Haley reappeared in the doorway a few minutes later, and Sophie stood up. "I'm gonna finish my drawing," she said, grabbing her sketchpad and disappearing down the hall. Haley looked at Evan, surprised. "That was more than I expected." "I'm not sure what just happened," he said, standing. "But I'll take it." "She doesn't trust easily," Haley said. "But she listened." "That's a start." Evan nodded. "Then I'll be back. If that's okay." Haley hesitated, then said, "Come by next Saturday. Same time." And for the first time in days, something loosened in Evan's chest. It wasn't a second chance, not yet, but it was the first real step toward one. The following Saturday arrived with heavy clouds stretching low over the city, hinting at rain but never delivering. Evan had barely slept the night before, his thoughts returning again and again to the brief conversation with Sophie. Every word she had said lingered in his head, not because they were sharp, but because they were honest in a way that only children seemed capable of. Her question, "Why now?" had echoed louder than anything else. He had answered it with as much truth as he had, but he knew he'd have to keep answering it with his actions if he wanted her to believe him. He pulled up in front of the same small duplex just before 11. This time, he didn't hesitate before knocking. Haley opened the door, wearing a soft gray sweater and jeans, her hair tied loosely at the back. There was a gentleness in her eyes this time, but also caution. She stepped aside without saying much, and he entered the house, now more familiar but still foreign to him in all the ways that mattered. It was a strange feeling, being inside the space where his daughter lived, and knowing he hadn't been part of the memories etched into its walls. He noticed new drawings on the fridge, a pair of sneakers by the door, the smell of something cinnamon-sweet in the air. All of it felt warm, and none of it had anything to do with him. Yet. Sophie was already in the living room, sitting on the couch with a book in her lap. She looked up when she saw him, and there was no smile, but there also wasn't that edge of suspicion from before. That, in itself, felt like progress. "Hi," she said simply. "Hi," he replied, relieved. Haley lingered near the doorway. "I need to run out for a few errands," she said, clearly giving them space. "Sophie, you okay if I leave you two for a bit?" Sophie nodded without hesitation. "We're good." Haley gave Evan a final look, one that said she was trusting him, even if only cautiously, then grabbed her bag and stepped outside. The sound of the door clicking shut left the room in a still kind of quiet. Evan took a seat in the armchair across from Sophie. "So," he said after a moment, "what are you reading?" She held up the cover. "It's about a girl who gets stuck in a library that turns into a maze. She has to solve riddles to escape." "That sounds terrifying and awesome." She shrugged. "It's pretty cool. But most adults don't get it." "Well, I'm going to do my best to keep up," he said with a small smile. She set the book aside and crossed her arms, studying him again. "Did you ever want kids?" she asked. Evan blinked. The question came out of nowhere, but it didn't feel like a challenge. It felt like a test. Like she was trying to understand what kind of man had missed her entire life. "I didn't think about it much," he answered honestly. "I was always so focused on work. On building things. Success. But, if I had known about you, everything would have changed." She narrowed her eyes slightly. "You were in London, right? When my mom found out?" He nodded slowly. "Yeah. I was promoted and transferred. I thought we'd talk when I got back, but when I returned, you and your mom were already gone. I tried to find her. My assistant told me she didn't want to be contacted." Sophie frowned. Why would he say that if it wasn't true? Evan let out a breath. "Because some people think they know what's best for others. Or maybe he just wanted to protect me from something complicated." "Like me?" she asked quietly. His heart clenched. "No. Never you," he said. "You were never the problem. You were the part one didn't get the chance to know. And I want to now. If you'll let me." She didn't say anything for a while. Instead, she reached for a small sketchbook on the coffee table and flipped it open. Inside were pencil drawings, some rough, some surprisingly detailed for her age. There were animals, trees, buildings, but mostly people. Faces. One of them, he realized with a jolt, looked like him. "You drew this?" he asked. She nodded. "Is that me?" "From the restaurant," she said. "I remembered your face." Evan swallowed hard. She had drawn him before she had ever heard his side of the story. Before she had heard a single apology. And still, she had captured him in a way that felt eerily accurate. There was a sharpness in the eyes, but also a kind of loneliness. "You're really talented," he said. Sophie closed the book and hugged it to her chest. "Mom draws too. Not like this, though. She paints. But she never shows anyone. Maybe you both could show me sometime," he offered gently. "Maybe," she said, and it was the closest thing to a yes he'd heard from her yet. They talked for another half hour. About school, about her favorite movies, about the dog she wished she had. Evan didn't try to impress her or act like a perfect dad, he just listened. And with every minute, the distance between them grew just a little smaller. When Haley returned, she found them sitting on the floor playing a clumsy, laughter-filled round of Uno. Evan looked up as she entered, his smile wide and a little breathless, and Haley's expression softened in a way she couldn't hide. Later, as Evan stood at the door ready to leave, Sophie looked up at him. "Will you come next Saturday too?" Evan felt something crack open in his chest. "I'll be here," he said. "Same time." And this time, she smiled. Just a little. But it was real. And for Evan, it was everything. Evan's Saturdays quickly became the part of his week he looked forward to most. Meetings, calls, contracts, none of it gave him the sense of meaning he felt when he knocked on the door of that small brick duplex. Each time he arrived, Sophie greeted him with a little more comfort in her voice, a little less hesitation in her eyes. What began as guarded curiosity was slowly unfolding into something warmer, something cautiously hopeful. And with each visit, Evan felt the weight of the years he had lost pressing more heavily on his shoulders, reminding him that everything he had now was borrowed time, time he was determined to earn. Haley stayed mostly in the background. She would be present when Evan arrived, exchange polite conversation, sometimes offer him coffee, but she never hovered. She watched. Not suspiciously, but like someone who was trying to believe in a future she didn't dare imagine. Evan respected that. He didn't push her. He knew that healing would come differently for her than it would for Sophie. Sophie was a child, resilient, open to new stories being written. Haley had lived through it. She had carried the silence, the loneliness, the weight of single motherhood, and she had done it with dignity and grace. That kind of hurt didn't unravel easily. But it hadn't made her hard. If anything, it had made her fierce and beautiful in a way that Evan had failed to see back when it mattered most. One Saturday, Sophie asked if they could go to the park together. It was a sunny afternoon, unusually warm for early spring, and Haley gave a soft nod before sending them off with snacks and a folded blanket. Evan drove them in his car, which Sophie was clearly fascinated by, though she tried to play it cool. They talked about her school projects, and Evan listened carefully as she explained how she was building a miniature model of a lighthouse. She said she liked the idea of something that stayed in one place but helped people who were lost. The park was quiet, just a few families scattered across the grass. Sophie ran ahead, racing toward the swings, her laughter echoing through the open space. Evan sat on a bench nearby, watching her with a mix of joy and grief. It was the simplest thing, a child on a swing, but for him, it was a miracle. He had missed so many firsts, and now even the smallest moments felt sacred. After a while, she ran back to him, breathless and flushed, and sat beside him on the bench. For a few minutes, they just watched the clouds drift slowly overhead. "Did you ever think about me?" she asked suddenly, her voice quiet, almost unsure. The question caught him off guard. He turned to look at her and saw something vulnerable in her posture, in the way her fingers twisted in her lap. "I didn't know I was allowed to," he said. "I didn't even know you existed. But now that I do, I can't stop thinking about you." Sophie nodded slowly, her lips pressed together. "I used to make up stories about you," she said. "I told my friends my dad was a spy, or a pilot, or a musician who played secret concerts around the world. Sometimes I said he was a superhero." Evan smiled, but it was a sad smile. "I wish I had been any of those things." "You're here now," she said, turning to him. "That's kind of like a superhero." Evan looked away for a moment, overwhelmed by the weight of what she had just said. He didn't deserve her forgiveness. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But she was offering it anyway, piece by piece, and he was going to honor every bit of it. They returned to the house just as the sun began to dip. Haley met them at the door, and something in her face shifted when she saw the way Sophie was leaning into Evan, holding his hand loosely as they walked. That evening, Haley invited him to stay for dinner. It was the first time. They sat around the small kitchen table, eating simple pasta and garlic bread. Sophie talked most of the time, retelling stories Evan had already heard in the car, but with more dramatic flair. Haley listened, laughing softly now and then, occasionally locking eyes with Evan across the table. Those moments were brief, but they were honest. After dinner, Sophie disappeared into her room to work on a drawing, and Evan helped Haley wash dishes. They worked side by side in silence for a while, the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled. "She's smiling more," Haley said at last, her voice low. "She's incredible," Evan replied. "You've done an amazing job." Haley looked at him for a long moment, her hands still in the soapy water. "You're different than you used to be." "I had to be," he said. "Back then, I thought success meant power. Now I think it means showing up when it matters most." She didn't say anything, but she nodded slightly, and it felt like a small door opening. When Evan left that night, Sophie hugged him for the first time. It was quick and shy, but it happened. He held on to the feeling all the way home. He didn't know where this would all lead. He wasn't thinking about labels or custody or the future in a legal sense. He was thinking about Saturdays, and sketchbooks, and dinner tables. He was thinking about the way Haley's voice had softened, and the way Sophie had started calling him Dad in her stories, even if not to his face. He was thinking, for the first time in a very long time, about what it meant to belong. Evan sat at his office desk late one evening, long after the rest of the team had gone home, surrounded by untouched paperwork and a half-drunk cup of cold coffee. His phone buzzed silently beside him, lighting up with back-to-back calendar reminders, but he ignored them all. For the past few weeks, his priorities had shifted so dramatically that even he could hardly believe it. Once, he would have been immersed in investor reports and product launch strategies. Now, all he could think about was a 9-year-old girl who liked lighthouses and cinnamon muffins, and the woman who had quietly raised her without ever asking for help. Haley had slowly let him into their lives, piece by piece, and every new part of their world he got to see felt like something fragile and precious. They had dinner together most Saturdays now, sometimes Sundays too. Occasionally, he helped with Sophie's school projects or picked her up from art class when Haley was working late at the library. These simple things, which once would have seemed like background noise in someone else's life, now formed the moments he clung to most. But the more involved he became, the heavier one question sat on his shoulders: what now? How far did he want to take this new role in Sophie's life? And more importantly, how far would Haley let him? That evening, after hours of thinking, he made a decision. A real one. He opened a blank document on his computer and began drafting his resignation letter. Not from the company entirely, but from his role as CEO. He had already been grooming a strong leadership team for the past year, and he trusted them. What he didn't trust anymore was time. Time had already stolen 9 years from him, and he wasn't willing to lose another 9 while buried in boardrooms and strategy sessions. When the letter was done, he sat back, heart racing. It was the most emotional decision he'd made since finding out about Sophie. But it felt right. The next morning, he asked Haley if they could talk, just the two of them. They met at a small cafe a few blocks from her work. It was quiet inside, filled with the smell of strong coffee and the muffled sound of early morning chatter. Haley looked curious but calm, stirring a spoon into her tea as she waited for him to begin. Evan didn't stall. "I stepped down as CEO." Her eyes widened slightly. "You did what?" "I'm still involved with the company, but I won't be running it anymore," he said. "It's time. I've spent my whole adult life building things that made money, but not meaning." Sophie changed that. Haley set down her cup, unsure of how to respond. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," he said. "I didn't do it because I had to. I did it because I wanted to. I want to be around. Not just on Saturdays. Not just when it's convenient. I want to be a real part of her life." She studied him carefully. And what if she changes her mind? What if one day she gets angry and pushes you away? Then I'll stay anyway, he said without hesitation. Even when it's hard. Especially then. Haley leaned back in her seat, letting out a quiet breath. You say things like that and make it hard to keep the walls up. He smiled, but not smugly. Softly. Gratefully. I don't expect you to tear them down overnight, he said. I know I've got a lot to make up for. But I'm in this. For real. And not just for her, but for you too. That last part hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken memories and feelings they hadn't dared to name yet. Haley looked down, fingers tracing the edge of her cup, then met his eyes. Then I guess I have to start believing that maybe you're really staying. I'm not going anywhere, he said. Not this time. Later that week, Sophie caught on that something had changed. He was picking her up from school more often, showing up with less urgency and more presence. She asked him point blank one afternoon, "Why are you here so much now?" "Because I want to be," he said. She narrowed her eyes. "Don't grown-ups always say they're too busy?" "They do," Evan admitted. "But I quit being that kind of grown-up." Sophie seemed to consider that. Then she asked, "So, does that mean you're really my dad now?" He felt the weight of the question. Not just its simplicity, but the hope tucked quietly behind it. "I always was," he said. "I just didn't get to be there. But I'm here now. And if you'll have me, I'd like to be your dad in every way I can." She looked away, pretending to be unimpressed, but her voice was small and full of meaning when she replied, "Okay. But you have to learn how to braid hair." He laughed. "Deal." That night, at Haley's house, they all had dinner together. Sophie set the table without being asked. Haley let Evan help cook. It wasn't fancy, just grilled cheese and tomato soup, but it felt like a family meal, the kind you remember even when you forget what day it was. Afterward, as they sat on the couch watching a movie, Sophie dozed off between them, her head resting on Evan's shoulder. Haley looked over at him, her eyes soft, her defenses a little lower than usual. "You're really doing it," she said. "You're becoming her safe place." "I want to be yours too," Evan replied. Haley didn't answer immediately, but she didn't pull away either. And in the quiet hum of the television, with the soft weight of their daughter sleeping between them, it felt like the beginning of something they might all learn to call home. The wedding was small, quiet, and nothing like the extravagant ceremonies Evan had once attended during his high-profile years. There was no press release, no designer guest list, and not a single camera crew. It took place in the backyard of the house Haley and Sophie now shared with Evan, a modest space filled with fairy lights strung through the branches of the old oak tree, folding chairs borrowed from neighbors, and a picnic-style dinner prepared by friends and family who had watched this story slowly bloom into something real. Sophie was the first to walk down the makeshift aisle. She wore a simple white dress with embroidered flowers along the hem and a crown of fresh daisies in her long brown hair. She took her role as flower girl very seriously, dropping petals one by one as she walked with deliberate steps and the practiced poise of someone who had waited her whole life for this moment. She had helped design her mother's bouquet and had even written a short note for Evan, which she folded into a tiny heart and slipped into his coat pocket just before the ceremony began. He didn't read it right away, but he felt its presence there, like an anchor pressed close to his heart. Haley appeared next. Her dress wasn't traditional, it was soft blue, flowing just above her ankles, with lace across the shoulders and a ribbon at the waist that Sophie had helped her tie. Her hair was swept back with a few loose strands framing her face, and her eyes were calm but shining. Evan watched her approach with a kind of reverence he hadn't known he was capable of. She wasn't just the woman he had loved once. She was the woman who had carried their child, weathered storms alone, built a life out of quiet strength, and still found space in her heart to let him back in. She was everything he hadn't known how to appreciate back then, and everything he never wanted to live without again. They stood beneath the oak tree where a local judge, a friend of Haley's from the library, read the vows with simplicity and grace. Evan didn't bring a long speech. Instead, he took her hands and said only what mattered. I spent years building things, companies, deals, futures I thought I wanted. But I never built anything that truly mattered until I found my way back to you. And Sophie, you gave me the only life I ever want to live. Haley's voice trembled only once as she answered. You showed up when it mattered. And you stayed. That's what makes you the man I want beside me, not the money, not the success, but the way you love the life we've created. When they kissed, it was quiet and tender, met with soft applause and the sounds of wind through the trees. Sophie was the first to reach them, wrapping her arms around their waists in a fierce hug that left both of them laughing through tears. The evening passed in a warm, slow rhythm. Guests ate at wooden tables under strings of lights, sipping lemonade and wine, telling stories of how Haley and Evan had found their way back to each other. Sophie danced barefoot in the grass with her friends, occasionally glancing back to her parents with a look that was unmistakably proud. Later, Evan stepped away from the crowd for a moment, reaching into his coat pocket to find the tiny folded heart Sophie had given him. He opened it carefully. In her slightly uneven handwriting, it said, "Asterisk, you're the dad I hoped for when I didn't know I had one. I'm glad you're mine now. Asterisk." He closed his eyes and let that sentence settle into the deepest part of him. It was more than he'd ever thought he deserved. And yet, here it was. As the night deepened, and the lights twinkled softly around them, Evan held Haley close, Sophie curled up between them on a blanket laid across the grass. The three of them lay under the stars, quiet, content, and whole. No one said it aloud, but they all felt it. This wasn't just a happy ending. It was a beginning. And it was theirs. This story is a quiet, emotional reminder that real redemption doesn't come from grand gestures, it comes from showing up, consistently, even when it's uncomfortable or late. Evan didn't earn forgiveness through wealth or charm, he earned it by choosing to stay, day after day, and proving that love is less about where you've been and more about where you're willing to go. Haley's strength was never in shutting people out, but in knowing when to let them back in. And Sophie, with her fierce honesty and fragile hope, was the heart that pulled it all together. The ending isn't about perfection. It's about healing. About a man who rebuilt a life not with power, but with presence. About a woman who risked her heart again. About a girl who finally stopped wondering and started believing. It's not a fairy tale, it's something more meaningful. A real, earned kind of happiness. And sometimes, that's the most beautiful ending of all.